Welcome back to our podcast series, Advice from Your Advocates. I'm Bob Mannor, certified elder law attorney in Michigan. And we are very pleased today to have Natali Edmonds, who's a board certified geri psychologist. Did I say that right?
You got it. It's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful. It even looks worse when it's in writing here. So Natalie's very interesting and really a trailblazer in this field. She's the creator of Dementia Careblazers, which has a YouTube channel with over 100,000 subscribers and 8 million views. She's really been a thought leader in this area, and I'm so excited to be able to have her on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about how you got into this. It's really interesting. So we've had a dementia focus to our law practice for the last few years. And how that came about is we've been working in the long-term care and providing folks with long-term care planning for years. And we sat back and kind of looked at the big picture, and we realized probably 70 to 80% of the folks that come in for long-term care planning either are dealing with a form of dementia or are certainly worried about memory loss and those types of issues. How did you land in this niche?
Well, for me, it was really working for a big hospital and working in the healthcare setting. And I was working primarily with older adults in a geriatric assessment clinic where people who were just beginning to notice some changes were starting to worry, is this normal aging? Is this actually something more, or family members concerned? And so the families would come and they'd bring their loved one, and we'd run them through a whole series of tests over a couple of days. It was an amazing team I worked on. I think it was a lovely, lovely clinic. But even so, the best we could do for the families coming in was to let them know, hey, we think you have this diagnosis. We'd sit around the table. We'd talk for a full hour with them, like pretty much the best I think you could get right now in the healthcare system is what we were doing. And then we said, we'll see you in a year. And I was just watching these families leave after we had just given them something they were so fearful of hearing. We gave them this diagnosis, and then they'd leave. And I'm just thinking, well, they're just getting started. Like, what are they going to do? How are they going to get the information? How are they going to know how to respond when the person with dementia maybe wants to go home and they're already home, or doesn't want to bathe or shower and it's been going on 2 months, or they might not even realize their wife is their wife. And so it just felt like there was a huge gap and something was missing. And as much as I worked with the most amazing healthcare providers there were, when you're being told how long you can spend with somebody and pressure to see more people and pressure to, like, you should be done with them or they've reached their therapeutic benefit. And I'm thinking, well, this is a disease that can last, a decade. What are these families supposed to do? So for me, I got started in the online space, just trying to fill in a gap of what I didn't have time to do in practice. And that was just answering common questions, challenges, obstacles family were facing. So I just started putting them online, not knowing it was going to turn into what it turned into, but really just seeing a huge gap in the healthcare system, which is not prepared to give the families of people with dementia the support and information that they need.
It's interesting. I felt that way for a very long time, and trying to have sort of that more holistic approach that really it's never, I think of a couple of movies that I refer back to where there's the superhero that just says, can't the world just stay fixed? And so the reality is you try to deal with the situation, the healthcare, folks try to deal with the situation, but then it's, even if we could sort of stabilize things and help the family kind of come to terms to it, it's never going to stay fixed. It's a progressive, all of these things are going to be progressive, and the next shoe is going to drop. The next change is going to happen. And the family often is not prepared for that. I kind of want to talk to you about that because in my experience, dementia as a category of diseases it can progress in a lot of different ways. So can you talk to us about sort of different types of dementia and how what our experience might be different depending on the diagnosis that we might receive?
Yeah, dementia is just a category term. The way I kind of describe it is it's like somebody saying the word cancer. The word cancer tells you somebody is sick, but it doesn't tell you what type. Is it breast cancer, skin cancer, brain cancer, Versus same for dementia. It's like dementia tells you somebody is having problems with their thinking and functioning more than they should be having for their age, but it doesn't tell you what type. There are many different types of dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the most common. That's why we hear about it the most. It gets the most money for funding and research. But there are other dementias like vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontal temporal dementia. You can even have more than one type of dementia. A lot of times, maybe we don't know the type of dementia, so it's just called like of unknown etiology. There's so much confusion around just how to get a specific diagnosis, and sometimes it's really hard to tell. And each of those dementias have different hallmark features, and there are different patterns that would show up in testing that we would look for. But even within the same dementia, like let's say two people of the same age have Alzheimer's disease, they don't necessarily look the same. They could present differently as well. So it's one of those diseases and categories that even with the same diagnosis, they can look different. So somebody with Alzheimer's disease may not recognize their spouse as their spouse, may not believe that the spouse is who they say they are. And somebody else with Alzheimer's disease may not have that problem at all. So it really is individual. Like one person with any type of dementia is just one person with that type of dementia. So there's so many different symptoms that can present. I think the commonality through them all is that it's challenging for the person who has the diagnosis and for the family members caring for them. There's so many challenges that come along. I think that's the common thread. But different dementias present differently, and even within the same one, it can present differently.
Yeah, that's a really good perspective that I got to remember sometimes, because I'm often encouraging families to try to get a more specific diagnosis than dementia. And so I know, especially family doctors and things like that are often reluctant. I actually think, and I'm not trying to be too controversial, but I think there's a bit of ageism in the healthcare field where once you get to a certain age, they say, oh, it's dementia, and then we don't really need to. I've had actually a few clients come in recently where their family doctor did not even refer them to a neurologist or a gerontologist or anybody in the geriatric fields, because they said, oh, that's just additional testing. Well, I think even though you're right, certainly things can present differently with the same type of dementia. Having some idea of what we expect, or obviously we're not going to have perfect diagnosis of what type of dementia it is, but we can have some idea. And I think that helps for planning for the future and having the family kind of understand sort of the distinctions. Whereas one dementia might typically have sort of a slow progression or typically downward progression. Others, like say vascular dementia, might have deep cliffs where one day mom wakes up and is completely different cognitively than they were the day before. And so I worry that sometimes the healthcare industry doesn't spend enough time with folks that are, they might be getting up there in age, and sometimes we just say, oh, well, they're old, why do we really need to do all this testing? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, there's so much to say about that. I think there's several things going on. For starters, I think the healthcare system has a lot of issues. And to think that, somebody coming in with concerns about dementia, or maybe truly has dementia, and to be seen for 20 minutes by a PCP with a waiting room full of people, like it's literally impossible, I think, to do a really great assessment or thorough workup within a short time period like that. So I've seen both sides where a family member is bringing somebody in with concerns that this person might have some type of dementia, and the healthcare provider says, oh, they're totally fine. And to think that they can say after 15, 20 minutes, this person is fine, when the family member has been living with them 24/7 and is seeing all these strange things happen, a lot of times the family members are going to have to become the advocate. And it's important that they get the information they need to at least be able to ask, well, can I get a referral to a neurologist? They might literally need to ask that, for that to happen, because I've seen both sides where the PCP says they're fine, it's just normal aging, right? And get out the door. Or they might say, oh, yes, clearly this is dementia, but there's not really much of a workup. There's not, well, let's rule. Dementia is it's not technically the diagnosis, but if we're using that as the category of what we're talking about, dementia is a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning you've excluded any other possibility. And the older you get, the more things that happen can appear to be dementia, like low hearing or depression or, certain blood levels off. So we need to rule them out. I think for most of the family members I talk to, they do want some answers, and they feel that it would be helpful for them to have a specific diagnosis that they can at least look into more, or maybe connect with other people who have that specific diagnosis. I think too, what I've seen a lot when I was working clinically in the hospital is that sometimes by the time the person gets to us for testing, they are in the moderate stage of whatever they have. And as all dementias progress, the symptoms and impairments become so severe that they can look all the same. So it's really a guessing game in terms of, okay, well, they're pretty much impaired across the board. So we're not seeing the pattern of whether or not we think this might be, Lewy body versus frontal temporal. Everything's impaired because it's been so long that this has probably been going on since they've had the test. But that's when we would look at, and that you need a team, you need the actual medical provider, neurologist, PCP. You'd look at their medical history and say, well, we think it could be this. And that's really what it all is at this point, is a really highly educated guess putting together puzzle pieces, which makes total sense why families are so confused about what's going on. And I really think in terms of what you're saying, encouraging families to get this specific diagnosis, it can be helpful. I know a lot of families prefer it. Sometimes it's not possible. And I think the majority of times, family members have to be the one pushing and have to be the one advocating to ask for that to happen. And neuropsychological testing, which might come from the neurologist referral or the PCP, but neuropsych testing will be what can really help identify what is going on. What is this possible dementia? What type?
Yeah, so many interesting things about what you just said there. And often, some of our listeners, this might be new information to them, that dementia in itself isn't the diagnosis. It's a category of diseases. And I think even though sometimes that's said, that there's just so many voices that people hear when the family's faced with a crisis like this. And sometimes they're reliable voices, meaning they are people within the healthcare industry. But I always look at it as often this is going to come up because of some crisis that came up, right? At least the way that it comes into my office is somebody fell, somebody wandered away, the police had to help them get home or get them directions or things like that. There was some kind of event or crisis that occurred. And then often they're going to go into the healthcare system, and they'll go in, maybe they go in through the ER, and the folks there kind of see that little slice of the pie, and then maybe they're admitted and the folks there see the little slice of the pie, and then maybe they even go on for some kind of rehab or skilled care, and there's still this slice of the pie. And one of the things that we often talk about is a potential reversible form of dementia is delirium. And often one of the questions I'll have for folks is, but what were they like a month before this happened? How, and because so often the folks that are seeing or interacting with that person, it appears it's presenting as a significant dementia, and yet it could be explained, where they might think it's Alzheimer's or something like that. but it may actually be a form of delirium that maybe if we kind of calm things down and switch things up and get a little bit more consistency there, kind of look at the medication, look at the whatever infections that we're treating, because I've had that happen way too many times where the family now is listening to the nurses and the folks that they're surrounding with, but all that person is seeing and interacting and trying to educate and doing the best they can under the circumstances, but they're telling them information based on sort of this image or expectation that this is this person's life now, when it could be something like delirium, which maybe there's a medical cause, or maybe there's a way that we can kind of get things back to a certain consistency that could help with that delirium.
Yeah, delirium, people with dementia are more likely to get delirium, but anybody can get delirium. And it's very easy. If you are an older adult and you have delirium, which is essentially a temporary confusion caused by some sort of underlying condition, usually an infection of some sort. If you are an older adult and you have delirium, it's going to be very easy to get a dementia diagnosis slapped on your record when that is not the case. And it's very easy to do if the person is being hospitalized or some sort of event happened. Those healthcare providers are not necessarily familiar with your loved one or with the person. And so it's just easy to say, this person's confused, they're 83, they probably have dementia, get slapped on the record. And that may not be the case at all. So again, it's like family advocating. I remember working with a case once, and it was an older lady, and they were saying she could not go back home and live alone. She needed to be 24/7 care. And her son, thankfully, was a medical doctor. And he's like, my mom was driving to the local grocery store and like the head of her social club and doing all of this before she had the fall and ended up in the hospital. This is not her baseline. And so that's a question, the healthcare providers need to be finding out, is like, what is their baseline of functioning prior to this hospitalization or prior to this illness or sickness? Because it's possible that we could get that person back to their previous baseline. And even if somebody has dementia and they get a delirium, let's say they have a UTI or there's a medication side effect or something like that, they're going to be even more confused. They might look even more impaired. And in that case, it's easy for a lot of people to just assume this is the progression of the dementia, when in fact, it's like we have something that could be treated and that needs to be looked at. So I always recommend, if there is a really sudden change that seems out of the ordinary, even if the person has dementia, go get them worked up and see if there might be an underlying condition that can be reversed and treated and the person can improve. They might not improve 100% back to their baseline, but they'll get a whole lot closer than if we just let that go, which is dangerous.
Well, I really appreciate your approach on all of this. We call it sort of a more holistic approach, where we're really trying to look at the big picture rather than the individual slices of the pie. And we have a couple of social workers on our staff, things like that. Historically, we had a nurse on our staff to try to kind of look outside of the just the legal, financial, and also kind of look at it from the standpoint of this advocacy for clients, for our families. And I feel like that's a good part of what you're doing with your web series and all of the work that you do. So kind of give us an idea of how folks can benefit from the resources that you provide.
The main resource I provide is through my YouTube channel. It's one video a week at least, where I am just talking about a common challenge or obstacle that a family member is probably facing if they're caring for somebody with dementia. Sometimes it's just education, like a topic about delirium, or a topic about how depression and low hearing can look like dementia, or talking about how do you keep their dignity when they're losing so much of their ability to do things. And that's available to anybody who has an internet connection and can access online, because what I have learned in doing this online and getting people reaching out to me from all over the world, there are some countries and places where the information about dementia and healthcare providers who have information about dementia is so little and not very much at all. And so they're turning online for help. And something a lot of people are really shocked to hear, even here in the US, just because somebody has fancy letters behind their name, whether that's an MD, a DO, a PhD, a SLP, an RN. The majority of healthcare providers do not have any specialty training in dementia. When they go and they get whatever degree they are getting, it is the basics. It's like the foundation. To have specialty training in dementia, that person would have had to go seek out that training, spend their own time and money. And after decades of and hundreds of thousands of dollars spending time and money for the basic degree, most people are not going and getting that specialty, especially in geriatrics, which is not one of the most lucrative fields in the healthcare field. So there's not a lot of incentive. So I think that there's a common thought that if you're in the healthcare field and you're seeing people with dementia, you have some sort of specialty knowledge about it. And that couldn't be further from the truth, unfortunately. So again, I'm going to say family members advocate if it's something doesn't feel right, or you have more questions, or you want a referral to a specialist, ask for it, look for it. Most people don't have it.
So important what you're saying there. It's absolutely true in the medical field. It's definitely true in the legal field too. Sometimes folks will, say, oh, well, you better go see your attorney or go see an attorney because of this dementia diagnosis. And attorneys are woefully prepared for this. They didn't even, the area, unfortunately, is called elder law, which is really not the ideal term for this. But the thing is, that field of elder law really hasn't existed that long, and even shorter time that they've maybe made it a optional class in law school. And it's really not something that most lawyers have ever even been exposed to. And there's so many things that are different and counterintuitive from what we learn about everything else. And I imagine the same thing can be said for a lot of the healthcare advice that someone might get in this situation.
Absolutely. I've had family members come to me and say, after they were diagnosed with dementia, or the PCP or whoever, and no knocking against any healthcare provider. It's not meant to be that, but it's just the truth of the matter and what people are telling me every single day. And sometimes what they're told is just put them in a care facility and live your life. Like, that seems to be a common recommendation. And there's nothing wrong with a care facility if that's the best decision for you and what you want. But to think that that is the standard, here you go, or here's a list of, so if you're lucky, maybe you get a list of support groups to go get help that they have no idea if they're even still in existence, who shows up, right, who's running them. It's just, it's a really heartbreaking to think how we are, I use the term support loosely, how we are supporting families trying to care for somebody with dementia, and what we are considering acceptable, I think is not acceptable. And I hoping to see that starting to turn, with people like you educating yourself, getting this information out there. The fact that you even have social workers on your team, oh my gosh, that's amazing, right? But I think we're still the minority here, and hopefully it will change. But I think the standard of dementia care, at least in this country, is very poor. And we have a lot to grow to make things better.
And there's so much that surrounds this with the family. There's so much the emotion that's going to be part of sort of learning this, coming home for Thanksgiving and realizing that mom's really getting confused a lot, or that dad really shouldn't be driving anymore. And there is so much that goes to that. And so that whole concept of, oh, well, maybe we should look at a care place. Well, that's something, but the reality is that's not the end of the story. Anybody that's ever had their loved one, whether they're ever going to care for them at home or care outside of the home, it's going to be an ongoing story. And I always say the best care setting is going to be defined by their worst employee. There's going to be some bad things that happen, and we have to have the toolkit to address those. So if we're not getting the care that we need, we're not getting the attention we need to address it. And we need to be able to make sure that there's a process and that there's management if we're outside of the home, or that there's a hierarchy to make sure that we get the right caregivers in the home. It's such an ongoing obligation of the family that even the concept of saying, oh, just put them into a care setting, that's definitely not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the story. One of the things that I think is very difficult about this area is so many times, and I don't know if you see this quite as often as I do, because often people won't call their lawyer until there's a crisis, right? Or won't call a lawyer until there's a crisis. So frequently what I'm seeing is this crisis that comes up because of some event, whether it was a wandering situation, whether as we just came home for Thanksgiving and realized how bad it was, whether it was a medical event, a fall, whatever the scenario is. But then we're put into a healthcare setting like a hospital, and often the family is told, well, you've got about 24 to 48 hours to make significant decisions about the rest of the life for this person. Now, that's not necessarily the real answer, but that's how the family's feeling often is, okay, they can't go home. Sometimes you're right that the healthcare industry will say that. And you better find a place in the next day or two. Well, that's nearly impossible to try to make those decisions. And often that's one of the ways that we can intervene to kind of slow things down and say, okay, let's make sure that we're getting all the days in the hospital that we're entitled to, maybe that we're getting some skilled care, because we don't want to be making these decisions rashly and uninformed. And often the family has no experience in dealing with this, and they're getting input. I always call it the barbershop advice. The barbershop advice, because I was in the barber one time and gentleman comes in and says, boy, I don't know what I'm going to do with mom. And the barber starts giving all this advice. And frankly, it was terrible advice, but, we're going to get information from all these sources. And I'm just so impressed with the resources that you provide. How do you feel about the family trying to quickly sort of get up to speed? Do you have any advice for them when this is thrown at them, and now maybe they've been in denial and putting it off for a while, but now they're asked to make some serious decisions for mom or dad or their spouse? What's some advice you have in that situation to try to just get an understanding of what needs to be done and how to make those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, for starters, contact an elder law attorney, hopefully a reputable one. There's bad advice all around and misconceptions, and it's such an individual process. I remember recently actually talking to a group of people, and they were saying, well, I can't put my loved one in a facility. She really needs it, but if I do, I'm going to lose the house. And I'm like, well, have you talked to, there's ways around all kinds of things. And
Right.
what happened to one person is not necessarily going to happen to you. Did they get the right legal counsel? Did they do the right protections in place? What was their particular circumstances? You don't know. Just like the disease is so individual for a person, so are the decisions that are going to be made and how you how you protect your assets and what you do. I think one of the best things is, as soon as you think something is going on, like to contact an elder law attorney, which is probably, I'm guessing, what you would say as well, just because sometimes people are waiting until after a diagnosis, and then you have that whole situation to take care of. And maybe there are some things that won't be possible afterwards that could be possible if you did them beforehand. But in the moment, if you're feeling a lot of pressure, you can always ask. The hospital should have a social worker on staff. So I think social workers are one of the best professions ever when you're dealing with dementia, to
Yeah.
talk to one of them. And if you can, like, contact a elder law attorney and tell them your situation and see how they can help. If you have serious concerns and you're feeling lots of pressure and something doesn't feel right in a hospital, each hospital should have a patient advocate that you can contact and let them know, your concerns or what's going on, and feeling the pressure. But it's not going to be a good situation, no matter how you look at it. Like, it's a lot of pressure. It's a really big decision to make, to think that you could do it in 48 hours, and to think you could even find a place that you would like or feel comfortable with, or would be a good fit for your family within 48 hours. I mean, we're asking a lot of these families, and it's hard.
Yeah, it's one of the things we often rely on. And again, we have excellent relationships with the hospitals and the social workers and the discharge planners. But one of the things, it's my job to provide advocacy. And so often we're helping the family just appeal the discharge from the hospital just to get a little bit more time. And maybe the appeal will get, decided in your favor, but at least it often will buy us some additional time. I know sometimes some of the folks in the insurance industry aren't fond of these little strategies we use to get more services, but the reality is that's what we need to do to be able to make rational decisions so that we don't have that readmission. One of the things that everybody's trying to avoid is readmissions, where it's that yo-yo effect of going to the ER, worse, going admitted, and then going home, going to the ER, going to admitted, maybe to rehab this time, and then home, and then just back and forth the readmissions. Nobody wants that, including the insurance companies. And so sometimes it's just a matter of let's try to work within the system in the ways that we're legally allowed to do, sometimes just to stall so that we can get a little bit more care in the hospital, a little bit more rehab sometimes, so that we can have time to make those relevant decisions. We've started training our because we also do, basic estate planning, wills and trusts and things like that. And so we started training our estate planning clients 10, 15 years ago. You go into the hospital, you call us. We want to hear about it before you leave the hospital, not after you leave the hospital.
Yes.
So
That's great.
It's such an important sort of time period to be able to make the right decisions.
Yes.
So what are some of the misconceptions about caregiving? Can you clear up some of the things that you hear people say all the time that you think need to kind of get straightened out a little bit?
Misconceptions about caregiving. I probably have a non-traditional thought process on this. One of the things is directly to the caregivers. I think a lot of times caregivers think in order to be a great caregiver, in order to be a great loving family member, they're supposed to love and like their loved one all the time. Let me tell you, if you're caring for somebody with dementia, let's just put it out there and put it in every book or resource you ever get. There are going to be times you are not going to like your loved one with dementia. You might actually be frustrated with them, even feel like you hate them, maybe even think to yourself, I wish this was over. And none of it makes you a bad family member. None of it makes you a horrible person. None of it makes you a bad caregiver. It makes you human. So I wish that every family caregiver would just know that it's not just going to be lovely. And no matter how much you love them, you're not always going to feel it in the day to day. And so just to normalize that, I think is really important for family members to hear. And then the common thing is, the whole reason I changed the name from caregiver to careblazer is because the typical connotation of caregiving, you sacrifice everything. There's just not going to be any time for you. There's going to be self-care is just a construct people say that's not possible. You're going to suffer. It was just so negative, a lot of what I was hearing about the common misconceptions of caregiving. But I think it's because we're getting bad advice from a lot of people, and we aren't questioning what we're being told. I think that caregiving is going to be really difficult, and many times I also think there can be very many moments of beauty and joy that can happen in between. Caregiving and self-care, like self-care is just care. It's just care for you. Which means it's going to be care for your loved one, which is going to be everybody around you is going to benefit. And a lot of times people think self-care means a spa date or a vacation or leaving the house or doing all of these things, when in reality, self-care can literally start with what you're telling yourself in your brain, how nice you're being to yourself. If you wouldn't say it to another person you cared about, you probably shouldn't be saying it on repeat in your own mind, which I think a lot of caregivers are really hard on themselves when it's just a hard situation. We don't have to make it that you're doing something wrong. So I think self-care is possible, but we're going to have to relook at what that actually looks like. And it's probably not what you're seeing on TV, probably not what you're seeing on other people's Facebook feeds or Instagram. I think that knowing right away that there is no right decision, there is no perfect decision. It's just going to be, you're going to do the best you can. And you don't have to beat yourself up afterwards when you find out how it worked out. You can just now decide, okay, now what am I going to do with this information? I think a lot of people feel like the person with dementia is supposed to agree with everything or supposed to like everything. And if they don't, then it somehow means the caregiver did something wrong, but that's not the case at all. It's just a complicated disease. And in many, many times, you making the best decision for your situation and for your loved one likely will result in the person with dementia not agreeing with that decision, because the reason they need you in the first place is because they're not able to make some really sound decisions with reasoning and critical thinking. And you're there many times to keep them safe or to make the the decision that's going to be in their best interest. And when the person with dementia might not even realize they have dementia, they might not even believe they need help or they need care. You're literally the person, making sure they're not driving when they're not safe, or making sure the bills get paid, even though they think that they can handle it all. So you're going to be doing things that, even though they could be the absolute best things possible, it doesn't feel good, and it might not feel like the best thing because the person with dementia doesn't understand it. I'll also say that when you're caring for somebody with dementia, lots of people have opinions, and lots of people will have opinions that are different than yours. And it doesn't mean that your opinion is wrong and that what you're doing is not the right thing. Until you're actually the person caring for the person with dementia day in and day out, nobody can know what is exactly best for you. You're going to have to make that decision. And so many people are going to give you their thoughts. And it's usually the people who never come around or who hardly visit or just talk to the person on the phone. This is going to be one of the biggest growth periods for the caregiver, just in terms of becoming secure in, what they're thinking, what they're believing, and standing by what they believe is right, even when other family members and friends don't understand. They'll either think the person seemed fine. I talked to them for 5 minutes on the phone. I don't know what you're complaining about all the time. Yeah. Or they'll think the person just, what's your deal? What's your problem? Just put them away already. And so it's really, I think caregivers can have self-care. I think they can have some moments of joy and pleasure. I think though they're going to have to question everything that they've ever been taught. And they're going to have to question what they want to believe. A lot of us are believing things we don't even want to believe anymore. Mm-hmm. And so it's a really big growth process for the caregiver. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but those are kind of like my initial thoughts.
Absolutely. That was fantastic. And first of all, I want to circle back to your channel there on YouTube and all those resources. But I want people to think about this from the standpoint of all those things that you said about caregiver. The definition of caregiver is not just the person that's there in mom's house or in dad's house, or that's caring for them potentially 24 hours a day. It could be the caregiver is also that person that is the go-to person, and mom or dad or spouse is actually in a care setting, like an independent living, assisted living, memory care, nursing home, that you still need a caregiver.
Gosh, yeah.
Yeah. So talk about that a little bit, about caregivers more than just those that are physically providing physical care. We still need that loving support, and it's still as stressful as everything you just said is still relevant, even if your loved one is already in a care setting.
Yeah, you're a caregiver even if you live long distance out of state. Maybe your person with dementia is still living alone or with their spouse, and might be the adult child, and they live in the same town, and you're traveling every now and then to see them, or they're placed. I'm thinking of I have a dementia care club, and one of the members in there, her mom is placed in a care facility. Let me tell you, she is not just sitting at home feeling like there's nothing she has to do. The care facility just recently went through management change. So there's a lot of now policy change and things that her mom was getting that now she's no longer getting. She's now trying to decide, do I put her in another facility or do I keep her there? I'm not sure. This management team seems like they're very interested in giving the greatest care. She's there showing up and taking a look and seeing what's going on, fielding the calls when the care facility isn't sure what to do or how to handle a situation. A lot of times when the person is in a care facility and they might have some difficult behaviors, I'm using in quotes, in the care facility, the staff is calling the family member, your loved one is doing this. They need to stop. What can I do? So it's not all rest. It's not all relief just because somebody is placed in a facility, or maybe they're living in another place, or even living with another family member. There's so much involved in caregiving that isn't always 24/7 hands-on care.
Absolutely. So just to clarify, the channel that you have that has all of these resources and kind of talks about all these different topics, which is so valuable. And I would recommend that people start looking at this and educate themselves about some of these topics before they think they need to. I always say this, to my seniors about, well, my advice is you get help, get care before you think you need care. If you want to prevent that broken hip, prevent that fall, lessen the likelihood you're going to kind of go down that spiral, get help before you think you need to. If you're the family member, start gathering these resources before you think you need to. If you have some worries about it, but it's not to the level that we need to make changes yet, now is the time to start getting educated and going to. So the place to find that would be, it's Dementia Careblazers. Is that the name of the channel?
Yep. If they just go to YouTube or just frankly type it in a Google search, Dementia Careblazers, it will pop up. I have hundreds and hundreds of free videos on that channel that they can watch. And I love what you said. A lot of times we unknowingly make things worse because we didn't have the education or the information we needed ahead of time. I'll talk to family members who, after watching a video, will say, oh my gosh, I've been correcting my loved one the whole time when they said somebody was in the house and nobody was in the house. And it's
right.
And they don't realize, and it makes sense. Like you're talking and communicating with that person the way you have the majority of your relationship. But because of this disease, we have to understand our approach and our communication needs to change. And when we don't, we actually make things a lot worse, and we make it harder for that person to want to accept our care in the future, when all we're doing is correcting them or telling them what they are believing is not true, or simply saying you are already home when they're home. We have to know the best approaches, ideally before they happen, so that we don't unknowingly put strain on the relationship and make things worse to the point that the person with dementia is becoming suspicious of the actual caregiver.
Talk to that a little bit more, because that's one of the most common things. And I get it. It's so difficult for family members. I've gone through, both of my parents had a form of different forms of dementia. And so it's so difficult to learn that communication style, especially for somebody that's never had to deal with this. And this is somebody that you've known and loved for 60 years sometimes, And so when someone is asking about their deceased loved ones, their parent, their sister, or when they are constantly repeating themselves or seeing things that aren't there, what is the proper way to address that, so that because this comes up, or asking to go home when they are home, all of these types of things. What's the best way to address your loved one rather than trying to correct them?
Yeah. So those are all very different situations, and we could talk more detail about how to respond in each of those situations. But the overall message for all of them would be, we don't want to correct the person with dementia when it's not necessary. And the majority of time, it is not necessary. If they are believing something that is not true, like they had a conversation with a relative and that relative has been deceased for 10 years, there's no need to correct them, because when you in that instance, remind them that that person is dead, they're grieving all over again because they didn't remember it. So you're sending them through that grief cycle all over again. So for the most part, as long as there's not an imminent safety risk, there's not an imminent danger to themselves or somebody else, they can believe what they want to believe. And it's also where it's really important to understand the disease, because if the person is seeing somebody standing in their living room and nobody is there, well, that's a visual hallucination. And no amount of you saying somebody is not there is ever going to work, because their brain is literally showing them somebody is there. And so obviously those are all symptoms you want to talk with their, medical doctors with. But in situations like that, you'll say, okay, you know what? I'm going to take care of it. You want to reassure them. You want to, at least at the bare minimum, let them know you hear them and you're not dismissing it right away. Okay, yep, you know what? Let's take care of that. And you would redirect them into another room, maybe give them a snack, a glass of water, talk with them a little bit, but only after you've heard what they've said. You've let them know that you hear what they're saying, you validate what they say. So many people, because of what the person with dementia is saying or experiencing is so off the wall or is not even in reality, they just quickly try to change it, quickly try to redirect it, quickly try to correct it each and every time, putting more strain on that relationship, sending a message to the person with dementia, you're not somebody on their side. It's going to make things so much more difficult. So don't correct. And really, unless there's an imminent safety concern, let them know you hear them. Like okay, I hear you. Yes. Oh, interesting. I see. All right, you know what? Let's figure this out. Here, let's come with me. Let's sit down over here and let's figure this out. And then you can go on to however you want to redirect them, versus shutting them down right away. Just because it's not your reality doesn't mean it's not their reality. And to for you just trying to tell them their reality isn't real is going to make them more frustrated, which is also going to make you more frustrated.
I love that answer, Natalie. Your first response was all of those require sort of, I gave you a number of scenarios, all of those require sort of nuanced answers. And I think so often folks are trying to categorize everything and just say, well, here's the magic answer. And there's not. That's just, everything is very nuanced, and it is case by case and personality by personality. Yes. You can certainly have sort of that basic understanding of acknowledge what they're saying, be part of that and acknowledge that you're hearing them and that you're appreciating them, and then the distraction. Certainly that can be sort of the general knowledge, but the idea that you have specific knowledge and you can go to your videos if somebody is saying, hey, I want to go home. Well, I'm sure you have a video on that they could get educated on how to address this. This is a constant issue. One of the things I'm dealing with, because there are many occasions where we are recommending care outside of the home, that at the circumstances that they're at, we're looking at it on a case-by-case basis. I know everybody generally thinks it's going to be better to get care in the home. Sometimes it's not better, and our advice is we need to seek care outside of the home. And one of the first things that comes up is that the first day, the first week, where they're begging to go home. And what I remind folks is, didn't they say that when they were home? Weren't they saying the same types of things? And so it's such a difficult, because there's so much guilt associated with all of this. When we have a loved one, we say, okay, I can't fully take care of you in your home. I can't quit my job. I physically can't take care of you. We need to get care out of the home. How do you address the family and their emotions and some of that sort of unwarranted guilt that folks have as a loved one?
For starters, I'd say allow yourself to feel all the feels. We're not robots. We are human beings. The fact that you would have some difficulty, some sadness, some grief around putting your loved one in a care facility, we don't have to make that mean something is wrong. We can just make that mean this is a hard situation in life. Like that's the psychologist in me is going to say, just allow yourself to feel those feelings. Now, make sure I have 3 steps that every family member should do if they're going to place their loved one in a care facility is basically, number 1, know your reason, right, for why you're placing them in a care facility. Most people in this situation who is going to struggle with putting their loved one in a care facility is because they love their loved one. They want the best for them. So what is your reason? And that's step 1. Number 2, make sure you like that reason. You like that reason because you realize they're going to have 24/7 care, or they'll be less likely to fall, or there's more staff members to give 24/7 eyes on them, whatever the case is. Make sure you like your reason. And then number 3, when that person calls you, says they want to go home, says they hate it, you start to question, you start to feel the guilt. You have to remind yourself of your reason. To think that we can just make this decision and that we're supposed to feel lovely and great immediately after, I think that's where a lot of the suffering comes in. It's like, why don't you just allow yourself to realize some days this is going to be hard, especially when you hear your loved one calling you and saying they're having a hard time. Of course, it's going to be hard for you, but you remind yourself, why did you do this in the first place? What was your reason? Make you like that reason. So that's a good reason. And remind yourself of that over and over again. Putting your loved one in a care facility for some people is the absolute best thing they can do. And for other people, it's not going to be. And so just make sure you're constantly doing your mind management. And what you said was such a good point when you said there's nuanced approaches to every one of these situations. I've, on my YouTube channel, hundreds of free videos. And I have several on, I want to go home. I want to go home. And those are just the general scratch the surface, what you can do on your podcast, you're trying to educate the broad audience. But for every particular situation, are there some adjustments? Are there some nuances? Are there things that we could work in to make it easier, better, a more smooth process? Absolutely. But you're going to have to contact your expert. You're going to have to contact somebody who has the knowledge and information and work through it with them. It doesn't mean it's not possible. One of the hardest comments I ever get is something to the effect of, this won't work with my loved one. It's but it doesn't mean not everything will work. But, when you're doing public education, you can only give one situation at a time.
Right.
And so that's a hard thing. Just if you're a family member and you're struggling and you don't feel like you've hit the tip, or you don't feel like you have the approach, or you don't feel like you have the solution. It's realizing you don't have it yet. Something is out there. There is help out there, even if it's just helping you manage the grief or the guilt or whatever it is. And I always remind my members, when you put your loved one in a care facility, can we just normalize the person having a hard time?
Yeah.
I would have a hard time if we have a hard time sometimes moving when we don't have dementia to another state and meeting new people and new neighbors and what's the trash schedule and, what light switch does this go to expect that somebody with dementia will move into a new environment and that they're just supposed to be okay without an issue, I think is a little bit unrealistic. But the problem is when we hear that they're uncomfortable, we sometimes make it mean we made a bad decision, when that's not necessarily the case. There's an adjustment period. And so we have to remind ourselves, it's okay. This is an adjustment period. We're going to get through it. I made the best decision I knew how, given all these circumstances, and just remind yourself of that over and over.
Well, it's one of the reasons why I really love your YouTube channel, because you can kind of go and learn it in sort of general thought process on these, but then there's some very specific things and how to kind of get educated to that. I want to shift gears a little bit to the folks that are just kind of worried about, well, will I experience cognitive decline? Do you have any advice or tips for folks that are saying, boy, so many people, maybe this happened with my parents or others, and is there anything I can do to try to get in front of that and help to lessen any cognitive decline?
Yeah, the research is really clear on this. The majority of people, even if dementia runs in your family, like Alzheimer's disease, even if it runs in your family, the majority of people are not destined to get it. Just because it runs in your family doesn't mean you are going to get it. You can have certain risk factors. You can have certain genes that put you at higher risk, but that doesn't mean you are guaranteed to get the disease. Lifestyle factors are so incredibly important. Unless you're one of the minority people who has a deterministic gene, meaning no matter what you do, you're going to get it. That's a very, very small fraction of the population. The majority of people have maybe a higher risk to get it, and it's not guaranteed, but you have to start doing things now. It's the things we've all heard about, but it's not like it's nothing new. Are you eating healthy? Are you sleeping okay? Are you getting regular exercise? Having social interactions? Loneliness is a risk factor for dementia. It's basic things like that are really going to be helpful. And it starts now. Whenever you're listening to this, it starts right now, because by the time symptoms manifest clinically, the changes could have been going on for 10 to 20 years underneath the surface. But the problem is, and you alluded to it earlier with so many things in our society, is we don't really do anything until after an emergency has happened, after something serious has happened. It's easy to just think, nothing we can do, but there's a lot you can do. And I'm not an expert in, well, what are the specific diets you should be having, or what are the specific exercises you should be? Just eat healthy, work, you don't have to belong to a gym and you don't have to run a marathon, but are you moving your body? Are you doing some aerobic exercise? Do you have some social interactions that are meaningful to you? Don't smoke. That's one of the risk factors. Basic stuff that we've heard a million times is going to be the best thing you can do to lower your risk.
That social interaction is so important that you just mentioned, and it's one of the things that over the pandemic that a lot of folks suffered with this, because even if they had sort of a social circle, often with older folks that went away and they weren't going to the senior center, they weren't going to play bingo or whatever it was that they had. And it's so important. It's one of the things that I look at from the standpoint of home care versus residential care. And sometimes there's a leg up on residential care because you're going to have more social interactions. And if the only people you ever see is your daughter or that paid caregiver, it's going to, it can have an impact on your cognitive abilities if you don't have sufficient social interaction. Is that right?
Yeah. And the research is really about the quality of those social interactions versus the quantity. So you could have one or two really good people that you like talking to and have meaningful interactions with, and that would be great. And you can have 100 people that you barely care about, and that would not be so great. So it's really about the quality. And I think one of the sad things is sometimes when family members are caring for somebody with dementia, everything becomes about caregiving, and we lose the actual relationship. We lose the father-daughter relationship or the spouse-spouse relationship. And there is not a lot of pleasant interactions there or pleasant events. So that would be something to work on if somebody is at home.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things where we encourage folks, especially spouses. So we're often dealing with a spouse they'd say, well, I've been caring for him or her for the last 50 years. I think I can do it. And my point on it is, well, we know two things, and everybody kind of knows this statistic that often it's the caregiver spouse that dies first because of all the stress that they're under. But secondly, they're not able to really be that spouse anymore. So we often encourage people to say, okay, we need to look at bringing in caregivers or look at a residential care setting so that you can actually go back to being the spouse, because if the quality of that social interaction is important, absolutely, I agree with you that you can get lost in the caregiving part of it and you no longer are interacting in that quality social interaction that is necessary to minimize cognitive decline.
Yeah. And don't let the ideal version of what you want stop you from being able to get what you can get. And I say that in terms of, like during the pandemic or whenever, you might not be able to go to lunch with your girlfriends. You might not be able to go to the golf club that you used to belong to. You might not be able to do these things when caregiving takes over. But what can you do to keep some social engagement for yourself? And then in terms of caring for your person with dementia, I always say do one thing a day that has nothing to do with caregiving. It doesn't have to cost money. It doesn't have to take time. But what is one thing that has nothing to do with caregiving that you can do with your loved one, even if it's a matter of just giving them a compliment, smiling at them, watching a funny comedy bit, playing a game? Just we lose track because the relationship has changed so much, or because we can't do what we used to do, which we would have been planning a cruise right now, or we would be going out, for happy hour with friends, and we can't do that. So we feel like we're just stuck in just the caregiving rut. And so I would challenge anybody who's in that situation to take advantage of what you can. And fortunately, I'm so thankful for the internet. You can connect with some pretty amazing people. You might, still be able to do a Zoom call or a FaceTime call, or even a texting or pen pal or something like that to keep some meaningful connection in your life.
Absolutely. Very good. So appreciate Natali so much. You also have a website. I want you to talk a little bit about. You have a Careblazer survival guide on your website, which is careblazers.com. Tell us a little bit more about that survival guide.
Yeah, you can go to www.careblazers.com. There's a free Dementia Careblazer survival guide. It's a free ebook you can download, and it really walks you through what can you do to not just survive this caregiving journey, but maybe find some of those moments of joy and interaction. How can you start to get your health back on track so that you can be around to continue to care for your loved one? What are the most common mistakes to avoid when you're caring for your person with dementia? Just the basics. If anybody is caring for somebody with dementia, that guide is just filled with, here are the basics. If there's nothing else you learn or nothing else that you do to further your education on this will at least get rid of the most common mistakes making caregiving more difficult. And so when you download it, it'll be delivered immediately to your inbox. And anybody can download it.
Well, I'd recommend that folks take a look at that. Thank you so much, Natali Edmonds from Dementia Careblazers, and joining us. Thank you for joining us on Advice from Your Advocates. Want to remind everybody that we do have a date for next year's annual Elder Advocacy Boot Camp. And we're providing continuing ed credits for social workers, nursing home administrators, and care managers. So that date is Friday, April 21st. It's an all-day event. And if you go to our website, you can check it out. If you want to sign up early, you can do that. But this is our 9th annual Elder Advocacy Boot Camp. So looking forward to seeing everybody there next year. Thanks again, Natali. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
Bye.